Okay, we've got about 15 seconds.
Okay.
Hi, this is Max Capopoulos from Newburyport Lacrosse.
You're live.
Good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson, and this is Life Along the Merrimack. We talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River. This is WJOP Radio 96.3 FM, Joppa Radio. And what I'm going to be doing today is talking about the river, and I'm going to be showing some slides as well. And it's one reason I'm doing this is because I'm writing a book. It's titled Merrimack, the Resilient River. So I'm going to move along and show some slides. I'm going to concentrate when I get to some of the key people, because the river is getting dirtier, not cleaner, and we need some of our public officials to help with cleaning up the river. And I have going to talk about several of them today. Excuse me. This is obviously the Merrimack River in Newburyport. In the distance is Plum Island, a beautiful shot really, and it shows the river on a great day. There are some fishing boats still in the river, as you can see. There used to be hundreds. Now there might be 6 or 8 here in Newburyport. And once was a great trade, but now not so significant. My book talks about the river from Newburyport all the way up to Franklin, New Hampshire. Here's a picture from Lawrence, Massachusetts, and it shows you that things are changing in Lawrence. You have the old mills, of course, the Merrimack, and a parking garage is going up. So Lawrence is making a comeback. Here is the start of the river in Franklin, New Hampshire, quite a bit different. It starts about 20 miles north of Concord, New Hampshire. There's no marking for it. I was surprised. It's when 2 smaller rivers get into merging in Franklin, New Hampshire. And this is what it looks like. Very beautiful, probably like it did centuries ago. One thing I want to talk about today is the people who are working hard to keep the river clean. Here are 2 of them. James Kelcourse is in the stern. He's a state rep. State Senator Diana DiZoglio is in the bow. They were involved in a tour called the Voyagers. This was last summer. About 12 to 15 people took kayaks all the way from Franklin, New Hampshire to Newburyport. And here is a picture of them in a quiet moment. And they've both been working hard to get money to clean the river. And by that, I mean enabling sewage treatment plants to improve. They created something that's called the Merrimack River District Commission, and probably about 50 to 60 organizations are involved. They've really been very helpful. Here you can see the river starting near Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire, coming all the way down to Lowell and kind of going northeast, and it gets to Newburyport. One of the favorite pastimes for many, many years has been fishing, and here's some fishermen on Plum Island. It's a pretty time of day, and if you've spent much time in Plum Island, you've probably seen fishermen along the surf. Now here's a person, this is Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, and way back in 1839, shortly after the mills were created on the riverbanks in Lowell, he said, this is not good. The mills are going to be very bad for the fish, very bad for the birds. They were polluting at that time, but beyond that, they were creating dams and canals, which made it very difficult for fish to get upstream. And so Henry David Thoreau, way back in 1839, was saying that this was a problem. But occasionally fish are caught. And here's an eagle on the Merrimack River. This is a wonderful photo by Brian Eaton. As the river has gotten cleaner, the eagles have returned. And here they need to fish in the winter. And if the river is frozen solid, as it has in some years past, they can't fish very well. They go further south. But here you can see he's on an ice floe and had a good meal of it. And here's Methuen, a pretty spot in Methuen. Every community really has beautiful spots, and this is one of them. This is a public launching area in Methuen on a pretty day. Here is a picture, obviously, of the Merrimack River. This is up towards Haverhill. One of the reasons why the river is vulnerable, not just do the sewage treatment plants emit much effluent, but also development is quite vigorous. There's a lot of houses and apartment buildings being built, especially in southern New Hampshire. And an organization called the American Rivers Group, about 3 or 4 years ago, declared the Merrimack was one of the most vulnerable rivers in the country, in part because of the CSOs, the sewage overflows. But this is because of too much building on the river. And so rather than having trees and fields, rainwater and impurities get straight into the river. And here's kind of an example of some development. Of course, this is what the old days looked like. And this is the Spigot River in Lawrence, which is right close to the Merrimack River. But you can see many mills. It looks quite dirty. The railroad had arrived, but this is, it provided mill jobs for many, many migrants. And if you were, Irish running from the famine of the 1840s in Ireland, or if you were Jews or Poles who were running from pogroms in Europe, to come to America and get a job was a very useful thing. Now, of course, much criticism has come down in later years, but for many years, communities along the Merrimack River took in immigrants, and there were many jobs. Here, one of the old mills in Lowell. I've always said that one of the great things about great job opportunities was not just working in the mill, but there must have been a huge industry in creating bricks. I mean, so many buildings were put together, and here's one of them. This is a water treatment plant for drinking water in Lowell. I was surprised to learn that close to 500,000 people in the North Shore get their drinking water from the Merrimack River. Now, of course, it's purified. Of course, it's scientifically handled. But this is another reason why we don't want sewage in the river, and we don't want chemicals in the river, because 500,000 people is a lot of people to be getting their drinking water. A beautiful shot here in Amesbury. Maudsley State Park is in the background. And on the Merrimack River, it takes all kinds. And here's what they used to call a cigarette boat in the Merrimack River earlier this summer. Again, you see the beautiful Merrimack River. This was taken by a drone, I must say. I did not rent a plane. It's a drone shot, but I think it's wonderful. And off to the upper right is the marsh. This is 25,000 acres of a marsh, which is very helpful to the health of the river, to the fish, the birds, many crustaceans. So you can see the beauty of it. And that is the largest marsh north of New Jersey. So this is a considerable asset for the Merrimack River. Derek Mitchell was one of the voyagers who went down the river, as I mentioned last August. He runs an operation in Lawrence, bring Lawrence together and improve the community. And he was one of about 12 who came down every day of the 4 days on the river. And in my book, Merrimack, the Resilient River, there's an essay that he wrote about the value of the Voyagers trip and what they hope to achieve. Here's an old picture of Newburyport, of course, was one of the biggest shipbuilding and international trade communities in the colonies, actually. Here's a wonderful painting by Richard Burke Jones. He is the city clerk of Newburyport, but obviously he's a very capable artist. This was in the 1850s, but look how large those vessels were, almost 300 feet, 500 tons. And the challenge about Newburyport was when the ships got this large and a little later, they could be built here and they could leave the harbor because the harbor is very shallow, but they couldn't return because if they're loaded down with cargo, it was too much. But here's Richard Burke Jones with a wonderful photo. Here's one of the last tall ships built on the Merrimack. This is a Symington. This is about 1893. You can see what a big day it was for people to come out. Children are there. Women got dressed up. There's an enormous number of people on the vessel itself. I love this photo. And here is late 19th century, before people had cars, and certainly before they had boats, because that wasn't till the 20th century avocation. Many people would like to take vessels on the Merrimack. They load up here at Merrimack Harbor and they go out for the day. And you can see there's quite a few people. Merrimack is a very beautiful river, and there are a number of islands in the river. In Newburyport, this is one just upstream from the downtown. You can see some of the vessels down there, some of the steeples, a city hall. And this is Brian Eaton took this. He's a photographer for the Daily News of Newburyport and is going to be retiring soon after close to 40 years with the company. Joppa Park is one of the many parks on the river. This is, as you know, going down towards Plum Island. And on that note, I would mention again, this is Life Along the Merrimack, a podcast weekly, 96.3 FM, WJOP radio, and it's Joppa Radio. So Joppa Park reminded me that, of course, Joppa Radio. The Coast Guard vessels are frequent sites here in Newburyport. Actually, the birthplace of the Coast Guard is in Newburyport, 1790. And the station here in Newburyport has about 26 coasties. They have many missions, and some of them are rescuing people who get caught right outside of the harbor. This is a common sight for mariners here in the North Shore. Ben Butler's Toothpick in Salisbury. It was built in the late 19th century. He was a Civil War general. He was the governor of Massachusetts, and he also lived in Newburyport for quite a time. So Ben Butler was honored with a maritime signal marker, almost like the old lighthouses. Here's another postcard from the old days. Salisbury Beach has, been a favorite for hundreds of years. Well, I shouldn't say hundreds, but more than 100 years, we'll give it that. And so here's an old postcard of Salisbury. And of course, here's the beach itself. If you've been around for a while, you know how beautiful the beaches are in Salisbury and Plum Island. This is the bridge that was put up several years ago, close to $300 million. John Greenleaf Whittier was the poet after whom it was named. This is the Whittier Bridge. And here's a pretty spot. Even though many communities that you can see, or many communities have mills on them or obstructions on the river itself, there are many parts of the Merrimack that are beautiful and look like they did decades ago. And this is one of them. This is above Merrimack. Merrimack, Massachusetts. And this is Brian Eaton took this photo as well. Beautiful shot of Amesbury. Lowell Boat Shop makes many vessels still. And here are a couple wooden boats in Amesbury. And here's John Greenleaf Whittier. Actually, when I get this photo put into the book, I will have to take out the bottom where it says halftone. But here's the great poet, and he wrote a very long poem titled Merrimack, and I am using that in my book, but that's the poet John Greenleaf Whittier, who was very prominent as a 19th century poet and was one of the really big fans of the Merrimack River. He was from Haverhill, lived in Haverhill and Amesbury, and was very well known in his day. Here is a story about, condensed, of course, some Native Americans and their life here before white settlers arrived. This sign is in Concord, New Hampshire, and it talks about the Native Americans who lived here for many years. But as I think a lot of people have learned, they succumbed to diseases, many that white settlers brought: measles, smallpox, and the last sentence says, once numbering in the thousands, by the 1720s, only a remnant of the group remained in the area. So that's an unfortunate story, but it happened in many parts of the country. Here's the beautiful spot, the town line of Amesbury and Merrimack. And as I say, every community has beautiful views from it. I went up and down the river and took most of these photos. This is Haverhill, the Merrimack River in Haverhill. Haverhill's making a good comeback. And this is an example. On the left here is apartment buildings. In the center, there's buildings for education. UMass Lowell is taking much of that building. And I like this photo because it shows the modern building for UMass Lowell and has an aged infrastructure. The bridge looks like it's been around for quite a while. Here's kind of a blue collar, committed person. Rocky Morrison is in the stern of this vessel, and he and his group clean up the river. They go from Haverhill up, through past Lawrence. And as I think you might know, strange things are still found in the river: bicycles, auto tires. Sometimes the automobile itself is pulled out. But Rocky Morrison and others are trying to keep the river clean. And here's Hannah Dustin. I didn't know of this legend, but Hannah was in about 1697, she and a group were captured by Indians. They slain her 2-week-old baby, so she was very upset, and they took her and a couple others from Haverhill all the way up to southern New Hampshire. The story goes that she had a hatchet, and you can see that in her hand. And when the Native Americans were asleep, she went and not only killed them by scalping them, but went off and sold the scalps. So this is a semi-bizarre story, but there it is, and there's Hannah. That's in a major park right in downtown Haverhill. And this is another photo. This is Lawrence in the old days, and you can see, you can't actually see it, but you can get the idea that late 19th century mills were a dirty process, and the river was very, very dirty. But here's a beautiful spot in Lawrence. Lawrence has a number of places that aren't very cleaned up yet, but this is a beautiful spot looking upriver towards a sailing and boat club in Lawrence. And here's, a very large dam, as you can see. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the mill owners, textile mill owners, built these dams so they could control the release of water. In other words, during the day when the workers were there, they wanted a lot of water going through their hydropower plants so they could power the mills. And so they built these large dams. And going back to Thoreau's thoughts, the dams may have served the mills, but they were very bad for the fish, because obviously fish would have an impossible time going upriver to spawn when you have a mill across the whole river. And again, here's Lawrence. It shows some of the old and the new. The buildings still stand, and here's a parking garage going up. The river here in Lawrence is about 3 feet deep. It does go to 15 to 20 feet in other parts of the river. It's relatively shallow. Here is one of the people that I think was a great person. Her name was Helen Swallow. And Helen Swallow, when she got married, it was Richards. And she was the first female graduate of MIT. And she was a scientist of water. And in about 1890, there are a lot of young people and people who live by the river who drank the river water. It was supposedly being clean, but not very well. So Mrs. Richards came up with some other MIT scientists and really created a better way of cleaning the water, and they were able to get rid of typhoid. So she is an unsung hero of the river and was, as I say, the first female graduate of MIT. This is what her work led to. This is in Lawrence. This is the William Wall. He was a senator in about 1990 when name of it was created, but it's an experiment station. This is where they develop clean water processes and make sure the drinking water is clean. Lowell has many facets to it. That's UMass Lowell. Off to the right, a dorm, and below there small shops, but you can see how many dams and how many hydro works this part of Lowell had. But Lowell upstream, has much recreational opportunities. And here's a fellow jogging. There's some fellows fishing. And so they, like Newburyport and other communities, have a long walk across the river where there's much recreation. In Lowell, also there is a National Park Service takes tours out, and you can see and they talk about the history of the river and the history of the mills. Now, they're not doing it during the pandemic, but next summer, with any luck, if you're interested in more about the mills, you can take a tour. This is a Lowell, once again, a different shot of it. And again, you can see the dams and the management of the water. Now, here is Amiskey Mill Company in Manchester, New Hampshire, dominated Manchester for over 100 years. This is an example of the mill being dominated by the river, if I can use the term. This is 1936. This is a tremendous flood that occurred in Manchester and occurred in Lawrence and Lowell and Newburyport. 1936 was a terrible flood. Manchester has done a good job. As you can see, there are mills on the right that have been made into college classrooms, into medical centers, businesses. And you can see beyond that, motels, banks. So Manchester has been very successful. Here is a dam that they built to create their hydropower. And this is Manchester in the spring. The water is high, and you can see how much hydropower that can probably create. This is an interesting spot where the Nashua River meets the Merrimack River in Nashua, New Hampshire. The Merrimack has about 8 major tributaries, and the Nashua River is one of the major ones. This is Franklin, New Hampshire. This is the start of the river. As I say, there's no real area that says this is where the river starts, but this is Trestle View Park, which is very close to the river. And this is another part of the start of the Merrimack River in Franklin, New Hampshire. So I did get in the car. I traveled up and down the river all summer. I traveled up and down in the spring also, but there was no foliage, so I didn't like that much. And again, a pretty spot along the river. As we talk about the past, this is one of the old mill buildings in Lawrence. This was once the second largest clock in the world, next to Big Ben in London. And you can see how large it is. And in the old days, before the factory workers had watches or many clocks, a big clock was very useful, so people could be aware of when their shifts were starting. And this is a shot from Lawrence. Canada Goose is actually living the good life. He has a few goose behind him. And so the river is polluted in many areas, but there still is wildlife. This is a wonderful shot of Cashman Park. You can see how many boats are moored in the summer. Close to 1,500 recreational vessels are registered with the harbor master in Newburyport. Beyond that is the marsh that I mentioned. That marsh is crucial to the health of the river, and we're fortunate that we have it. Now, a couple people that I want to talk about. Ed Muskie was a senator from Maine, and he engineered the Clean Water Act of 1972. And everybody who is familiar with the river will say that the Merrimack River started getting cleaner after 1972. And it was federal money went for grants, so communities could build sewage treatment plants. Now, some of them had rudimentary plants, but there was nothing too scientific. And there was a lot of effluent going from homes and factories, and the river, as many people who were around in the 50s and 60s will tell you, was really dirty. But Ed Muskie was worked for many months on the Clean Water Act. In fact, I have an excerpt from his diary, and it says he chaired at least 33 meetings so people could discuss the Clean Water Act. And here's an example of when the river looks good. Here again, we have a beautiful shot of the Merrimack. There's a sandbar you can see. This drives people crazy when they come to Newburyport. And if they're coming at low tide and they don't know about that sandbar, it's a bad thing. Now, I bet you haven't seen a picture of Richard Nixon lately. When I saw this, I was quite amazed because I hadn't seen one of him either. Those of us who lived through the 70s remember him as a bit of a rogue from Watergate. But he actually, during his tenure, 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency was created. And that led forth to many different elements, and including the Clean Water Act. So that's Richard Nixon on the left. Hubert Humphrey is in the center, and Ed Muskie is at the right. And so, although I had no clue that Richard Nixon was part of the environmental movement, it was during his administration that the EPA was created. Now, I must report that when Muskie got the Clean Water Act through, President Nixon vetoed it. So I guess he wasn't that much of a saint after all. But unlike today, the Senate and the House overrode the veto. So Clean Water Act started in 1972, and it helped the Merrimack, it helped rivers in Maine, the Kennebec, the Androscoggin, the Penobscot, and the Great Lakes. I mean, the Clean Water Act of 1972, that's your takeaway from today. It was very useful. Here is another fellow who was very instrumental in clean water in New England. George Mitchell, like Muskie, was a senator from Maine. And in 1987, when Ronald Reagan was president, President Reagan wanted to get rid of the Clean Water Act. And he said, I don't want us to keep giving these grants to communities, even if they are going to build sewage treatment plants. So George Mitchell was very capable. He was, and he created a compromise that called the Amendments of 1987. And it said that communities would still get low interest loans. He had to compromise, and that the grants, and a grant, of course, is better than a loan because 90% of it is free money. But the grants were discontinued because of President Reagan. But George Mitchell was the one who led the drive to get the amendment to create low interest loans. And so George Mitchell is a real hero as well. And here are a couple more shots. This is, they say that you can find a lot of things on the Merrimack River, and we'll close with this one. But this is Senator DiZoglio. She was one of the Voyagers. They were upriver, obviously up in southern New Hampshire. They come around the bend, and here's a herd of cattle that were in the water. And so this is a most unique shot. Dan Grovac, who is the chair of the Merrimack River Watershed Council, took this photo. But there is Senator DiZoglio. There is a herd of cattle. And so I think this is the most interesting photo. So thank you for being with us. This is Life Along the Merrimack. I'm Dyke Hendrickson. With this podcast, we talk about the health and the history of the Merrimack River, 96.3 FM, Joppa Radio, WJOP. I'll be back next week. I have new slides, new things to talk about. So if you like the Merrimack River, please join us next week. Thank you very much.